This moment comes from a House oversight hearing where Donald Norcross goes straight at Pete Hegseth over the collapse of the defense industrial base. Norcross doesn't waste time. He brings up 40,000 lost jobs, then presses Hegseth on a report that's years overdue. Hegseth tries to keep it broad, but Norcross tightens the pressure and shifts to the decision to strip collective bargaining rights from DoD workers. The questions get sharper, the answers stay vague, and the tension builds fast. Subscribe to the channel, and let's get to the video.
Mr. Secretary, it's well known that our defense industrial base and maritime industrial base has declined greatly over time. It's the shipyards, it's many of the things that you already spoke about. In my community, we used to have 3 shipyards, 40,000 workers. We've lost that critical job skills there and 40,000 people who know how to do it. And quite frankly, most of it went overseas because it was cheaper. Well, cheaper doesn't buy the security we need for our industrial base. I championed a provision in the 24 NDAA entitled Enhanced Domestic Content Requirement for Major Acquisition Programs. Had to do with our industrial base making things here in America long before this administration came in. The goal was to strengthen our supply chains and have that critical oversight, push for greater investments, much of what you're doing now on these major defense acquisition programs. So we passed that in a bipartisan manner because we knew that this was critical and things can happen. Lo and behold, here we are. There was a reporting requirement in that calls on you, the Secretary of Defense, to establish an information repository, issue rules, create a fallback process to govern the Department of Defense. We wanted to better understand much of what is being done here, but it's not being reported back to us. I sent to your office on January 8th, followed up on February 4th. We're years overdue on this report that will give us insight onto how we're addressing it. We hear what you're saying, but can you commit that we will get that report to us in the next 30 days?
Unless Jay has additional details, I'll make sure we look into it. Whatever we can get to you as rapidly as possibly, we will. We'll also check with the new Navy leadership and make sure they're complying as rapidly as possible with every aspect that could apply to shipbuilding. That's been our focus on the Navy side.
It's not just shipbuilding, major acquisition programs across the board. This is incredibly important, and they are ignoring this. And 30 days is being generous, certainly. Second issue is you talk about championing the American worker and how important this is. Yet in a memo on April 9th, you terminate all the collective bargaining agreements across the DoD, taking away from hundreds of thousands of workers at DoD their collective bargaining rights that they voted for. There was nothing to indicate there were any issues with any of the bargaining agreements, yet you decided to take away from them. Over the last few years, we have increased the wages for those war fighters, incredibly important. This year, up to 7%. Yet on the other side of this, you talk about supercharging the defense industrial base. We are in this. How do you go and say, yes, we support the war fighters? They can't do their job unless we are building things that they can use. Yet, no evidence to prove that these collective bargaining agreements were a problem anywhere across the Department of Defense under Democrat and Republican administrations. How do you kind of square that circle that you care about this, yet you take away their voice in the job?
Well, certainly, sir, the great workers that whether they're contractors or DoD civilians that do the important work for us, the great ones are going to stay. And we've invested more in merit bonuses for civilians than any administration previous. So if you're doing great work, you're going to stay and you're going to have even more opportunities. But with our ear to the ground in those shipyards and other factory floors, there were issues with collective bargaining, which led to restrictions to the workforce and our ability to move faster.
If I may,
and in that case, we made the decision to provide additional flexibility.
You didn't take it away from the shipyard workers. You took away from Department of Defense employers where there hasn't been any issues. Let's be clear. Those are independent contractors, and they have their collective bargaining agreements. The ones that work for you.
The ones that work for us should be at will like anybody else based on their performance and If they're performing well, which I'm sure they are, as you've represented, they will have a job at the Department.
So where is the issue that you took away their collective bargaining rights? Why did you do it if it wasn't a problem?
Well, I stated up front, it has been a problem. There are plenty of cases, whether it's contract or inside our own department, where collective bargaining had led to arrangements and agreements that minimize the efficiency and effectiveness of employees at the point of their impact. That's what we were focusing on, and that's why we made the change, which we very much stand behind.
Well, I yield back.
Let's stop pretending this was some balanced policy discussion. It wasn't. This was Donald Norcross pressing for accountability and Pete Hegseth sidestepping it in real time. Norcross opens with something very concrete. 40,000 shipyard workers gone. Skills gone. Entire industrial capacity hollowed out because it was cheaper to build somewhere else. And then he points to something specific he actually did. The domestic content requirement in the NDAA. A mechanism designed to force production back into the United States, strengthen supply chains, and rebuild that lost capacity. So far, that's not controversial, that's baseline. But then he gets to the real issue. The report. A reporting requirement that's already overdue. Years overdue. Norcross says he reached out January 8th, followed up February 4th. Nothing. No report, no transparency, no update on what the Department of Defense is actually doing with the authority Congress gave it. So he asks a direct question. Can we get it in 30 days? Hegseth's answer, I'll make sure we look into it. That's not leadership. That's deflection. Because if this was truly a priority inside the Department of Defense, that report would already be sitting on his desk. You don't need to look into something that's been mandated, funded, and overdue for years. Either the system is not functioning, or the accountability isn't being enforced. There's no third option. Then Norcross pivots. And this is where it really starts to break. He brings up the April 9th memo, something Hegseth already signed off on, terminating collective bargaining agreements across the Department of Defense. Hundreds of thousands of workers. Gone. And Norcross connects it directly to Hegseth's own talking point. Supporting the American worker. So he asks him to explain it. How do you claim to support the workforce while removing the very structure that gives that workforce leverage? Hegseth's answer is revealing. He says the great workers will stay. He talks about merit bonuses. He talks about rewarding performance. That sounds clean. It sounds efficient. It also ignores how real systems operate. You don't rebuild a defense industrial base on individual performance incentives. You rebuild it on stability. Skilled labor doesn't come back into a system where their protections can disappear overnight. The same 40,000 workers Norcross is talking about, they didn't just leave because of wages. They left because the system stopped being reliable. Then Hegseth tries to justify it by saying collective bargaining created restrictions, slowed things down, reduced efficiency. All right. Then prove it. Where? Which program failed because of it? Which shipyard was delayed because workers had too much leverage? Which contract collapsed because employees had a voice? He doesn't say. He keeps it vague. There were issues. There are cases. And Norcross doesn't let him slide. He draws a clear line. These are Department of Defense employees, workers inside the system. And there has been no demonstrated crisis that justifies stripping their bargaining rights across the board. So now the contradiction is sitting right in front of you. Norcross is saying, we lost critical workforce capacity and need to rebuild it. Hegseth is saying, we need speed, so we're removing the structures that protect that workforce. Those two things do not align. You don't rebuild an industrial base by making the workforce more disposable. You don't attract skilled labor by telling them their job security is now tied entirely to internal discretion. That's not strengthening the system. That's centralizing control. And that's the part people miss. When Hegseth talks about flexibility, what he's really describing is fewer constraints on leadership, fewer negotiations, fewer barriers to making decisions quickly. But removing constraints doesn't automatically improve outcomes. It just removes resistance. Now look at the bigger picture. Norcross is asking for transparency, reports, measurable progress, accountability for policies that were already passed into law. Hegseth is removing friction, streamlining authority, reducing the influence of the workforce inside the system. If you remove oversight and worker leverage at the same time, you don't get efficiency. You get opacity. And opaque systems don't rebuild industrial capacity. They hide failure longer. So this isn't just a disagreement about labor policy. This is a clash between two completely different approaches. One side is trying to force accountability into the system. The other side is trying to make the system move faster by loosening the internal checks.
And right now, the results aren't there. No report, no concrete examples, no measurable proof that these changes are actually improving anything, just statements. And if you're paying attention, that gap between what's being said and what's being shown tells you exactly where things stand.